Since the dawn of time, humans have faced that all-too-relatable feeling of going about one's daily routine only to suddenly realize that... I want to be here! For as many responsible, productive members of society out there, there also exist a few dozen more stuck in the muck of their lives, yearning for something more than this simple provincial life. And while we can't all be literally whisked away by giant hunky man-beasts to live secluded lives among talking silverware, we can at least seek refuge in the one place that no one else can touch. Our imaginations. As far back as the 1800s, there have been recorded instances of what has become known as Isekai, stories in which humans are whisked away from their humdrum life and thrust into a world free of responsibility at the expense of literally everything else. In Japan, the earliest example of Isekai comes in the form of Urashima Taro, a fisherman rewarded for saving a turtle by being brought to an undersea kingdom, only to realize that time passes differently in that world, being brought back to his home village 300 years later than he thought. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, the genre of portal fantasy stories received its origins with Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, telling the story of said Connecticut Yankee Hank Morgan and how a bunk to the head whisked him to England during medieval times. Both stories have been instrumental to isekai-style stories in their respective countries of origin, serving as a simple means to jettison human characters out of our world to one more... appealing. What I'm trying to say is Garfield being whisked off into a magical world where he's mega swole and fights off Frankenstein creatures as made by a BDSM vet totally makes sense under the circumstances of what that genre is already established. But before I get too into that, let's address the state of Garfield at the time in question. Before it became an internet deity synonymous with cosmic/body horror for the simple reason of being a pop culture mainstay with thematic lore adjacent to that intent, Garfield... well, he remained Garfield. What fascinates me about the Garfield Isekai is not just the fact that it exists, but the fact that it chose to exist at a time when it honestly didn't have to. The mid to late 90s was what I'd consider the silver age of Garfield within the cultural zeitgeist. The character and franchise was already a ways out from the boom of the 80s, but still a few years away from the Bronze Age that I'd consider the live-action era. Garfield was comfortably coasting off the popularity of its now decade-old animated cartoon, as well as its general omnipresence in pop culture and everywhere else. And while the property itself had about the same level of relevance as Madonna past the 80s, the source material newspaper comics have yet to really enter that phase of cookie-cutter formulaicness quite yet, with a handful of standout arcs, running gags, and overall solid observational humor that have been given just enough of a spin to not feel completely stale. In 1998, Garfield had absolutely no reason to innovate any further, and could have easily entered its modern age of malaise way earlier if it wanted to. And yet it persisted. What would eventually be known as Garfield's Pet Force was the brainchild of multiple Paws Inc. members. It's a production company made to support the Garfield comic strip and its licensing. Back in 1993, head honcho himself Jim Davis was having a creative session with fellow employees for t-shirt designs, when Gary Barker, longtime assistant to the Garfield comic, approached Davis with designs of a muscular superhero-style rendition of the cast. Liking the sketch, Davis brings in Paws writer Mark Acey to develop character profiles for these superhero versions of Garfield and Company. What he came up with was a superhero team of G-Force, which, due to legal reasons, was eventually renamed to Pet Force, on recommendation of Paws Vice President Jill Hahn. Character names and designs were further tweaked, and an animated short was developed for potential buyers, eventually finding a home with Scholastic, thus giving birth to not just an isekai, but an isekai light novel spin-off series, which, again, sounds really weird until you consider the circumstances of what's already been established. Garfield is no stranger to the publishing world. Even outside of their standard volumes collecting daily and Sunday comics, the franchise has churned out joke books, trivia books, anthology series, motivational handbooks, you name it. The majority of these books were published by Ballantine Books, a subsidiary of what's now Penguin Random House. Where things get strange, however, is when we start looking into the books that closer resemble novels. When it comes to short, text-centric books aimed at early to middle-aged readers, the publication history is suddenly all over the place. You've got budget books, Troll Communications, Grosset and Dunlap, just this really big spread. And while the latter is also a subsidiary of Penguin Random House, the fact these Garfield books are spread across at least 3 different publishers when you'd think they just stick with the one is wild to me. Even wilder when the company that ends up publishing Pet Force is yet another company, Scholastic, which I'd argue ended up being for the better. While the Garfield superhero series would have been a better fit at a comic book publishing company, the state of comic books in the 90s wasn't exactly the most stable. So for Scholastic to swoop in with a save served as a mutually beneficial move for both parties. On the one hand, Scholastic was able to get their hands in the Paws cookie jar. On the other, Paz was able to have their weird superhero isekai greenlit and distributed by publishers that knew their audience. It's a bit hard to express the sheer force of Scholastic during the 90s considering how vastly different children's publishing has become, but they were a major factor to children's literacy when I was growing up. Between Goosebumps, Animorphs, Babysitter's Club, Captain Underpants, and at least a dozen Roald Dahl books, Scholastic prided itself in its long-running series, using the power of numbered sequels that can more or less be read in any order to keep kids hooked on their IPs, creating this culture of not just reading, but collecting. And I'm sure it was this mentality that made them sign on to Pet Force as well, convinced they had another IP on their hands that would dominate monthly book orders and school book fairs into the foreseeable future. And they weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. Growing up on newspaper comics, I was always bitter that my grade school teachers never allowed any type of comic books to be included when doing book reports. I remained of the opinion that adults shouldn't put any barriers to literacy when it's already difficult to get kids to start reading in the first place. So this whole unspoken pecking order of what counts as fine, upstanding literature has always felt like this self-defeating notion. This artificial rule that only makes kids hate reading that much more if they're not allowed to read what they want. So you can only imagine my surprise when I walked into my school's Scholastic Book Fair to see proudly displayed on the front shelf Volume 1 of Garfield's Pet Force. An actual real-deal chapter book that my teachers can't say shit about. I could just feel the last remains of my social status erode to dust as I begged my mom for that first volume.
Yeah.
Garfield's Pet Force was a series of 5 children's chapter books released from 1997 to 1999, all written by a one Michael Teitelbaum, who I feel doesn't nearly get as much credit as the Paz team for making the series what it was. Not only was he not listed anywhere on the Pet Force section of archived Garfield.com pages, but he wasn't even listed on the cover of all 5 volumes of the series, given 4th billing on each book after Davis, Barker, and AC on the inside cover page. But hey, they bulleted his name, which I guess is something. Next time someone doesn't want to pay me for an art commission, I'll make sure to at least ask them to credit my name in size 30 Wingdings font. From a marketing standpoint, I get that these kids are more familiar with Jim Davis's name in relation to the Garfield brand more than anything else, but damn, at least have the decency to include Teitelbaum on the front cover of these things. At the very least, I'll say I'm glad Teitelbaum was able to make it on the other side of these books alright. To this day, he still remains in children's publishing, having written multiple early reader series based on big-name titles, as well as some notable non-fiction aimed towards children like the Marvel and DC encyclopedias. The guy seems to be a big fan of horror too, even releasing some children's monster books parodying Eric Carle's Very Hungry Caterpillar in early 2020, so good on him. The Outrageous Origin was the first of the Pet Force chapter books, released in 1997, focusing less on the characters in that world and more on easing the audience into its general premise, which is admittedly a lot to wrap your head around as a kid. We're first introduced to Garfield and his entourage of Odie, Pookie, Arlene, Nermal, and John on a summer barbecue in the backyard. Already you know something interesting has to happen, since the scene alone is like 4 characters more than I'm used to reading in a typical Garfield comic. Meanwhile, in an alternate reality on the planet Polyester, the Pet Force comprised of Garzuka, Odious, Starlina, Abnormal, and Kompuki have chased down the villainous Vetvix to her comically exposed hidden lair, only to all be trapped within a gigantic metal prison. Vetvix laughs as she begins her evil monologue. This weapon has another nasty little side effect. It will transport you to a ghostly dimension where you will live forever. You will not be dead, but you will also not be able to communicate with anyone in your own dimension. One by one, the members of Pet Force fell to the ground in pain. They grew weaker and weaker, and then suddenly they vanished. The green light disappeared. The metal prison, which just seconds before had contained the 5 superpowered beings known as Pet Force, was now empty. I understand that self-censorship in children's media as a means to skirt around actual violence is a thing, but even keeping that in mind, the idea of being sent away to be forever alone and separated from your loved ones is a scary concept to chew on, even as an adult. You've just spent the past 3 chapters following these heroes on a journey to catch the bad guy, only to find that not only does the bad guy get away, but she completely erases our heroes from their reality entirely. No search parties are ever sent out, nor are any attempts ever made to get the Pet Force out of that ghost dimension. The following chapter, we see the Pet Force's damaged ship autopilot its way back to base, where Emperor John's just like, oh shit, I think I need new superheroes. I remember as a kid flipping back to earlier pages of the Pet Force team and just thinking, wow, these guys don't exist anymore. This is of course a means to work Garfield and company into this alternate universe, but it's still a really bleak way of doing it. Once Emperor John figures out things took a turn for the worse, he gets his trusted companion, Sorcerer Binky, to come up with a magical solution. The rest of the book plays out as you'd think. Garfield and friends are isekai to planet Polyester in their new Pet Force bodies, the gang quickly masters her powers and saves the day before being sent back to their own dimension until the next time. This all happens more than halfway into the book, and it feels a lot like a race to the finish at this point. Though in fairness, you traumatize your audience with mass banishments to a ghost dimension, so everything past that's just gonna be noise. It's not until the second book that the series really starts getting a feel for its characters and what it wants to do with them. Pie-Rat's revenge brings Vetvix's reluctant lackey Pie-Rat into the spotlight as the main villain, and he's pretty good. After the events of the first book, he's sworn revenge on both Pet Force and Vetvix, which sets up a good dynamic between the three groups. Pie-Rat eventually hunts down Vetvix and steals her magic pendant, only for Pet Force to intercept him. You'd think the jig is up and the day is saved when the pendant ends up taking control of Garzuka, Lord of the Rings style, who decides to ditch Pet Force in favor of hanging out with Pie-Rat, which is honestly really funny to me. Like, Garfield could have just left and been evil by himself, but he really just swapped out his old friend crew for a new one.
Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, you're cool, and fuck you, I'm out!
What's even funnier about this is Pie-Rat and Garzuka end up being a pretty good team. For the uninitiated, besides being fat and lazy, Garfield can also be really mean, especially to his friends, which the series makes a point to illustrate constantly. Even when they're isekai'd, Garfield is constantly snippy to the rest of his colleagues, who are more than happy to return the favor. So for Garfield to ditch them in favor of someone equally fat and lazy makes for this new dynamic that's honestly closer to how actual friendship works. The bromance is strong between Garzuka and Pie-Rat, to the point that if they actually adapted these books properly, I would have wanted a Garfield and Friends style musical number as the two joyride through the galaxy with their very specific brand of fat people havoc. The character interactions here are just really solid, and even the inevitable de-villainizing of Garzuka is slowly chipped away in a manner that I appreciated as an avid reader of the comics. Books 3 and 4 feel like the series is starting to coast, mainly in that they don't delve into their premise as well as Book 2 does, but they're still pretty solid entries. Canine or Dog of Doom has Vetvix's return as the main villain, as she creates a giant creepy muscular dog man to match Pet Force's team of creepy muscular animal men plus one mascot character. Which, side note, can we talk about the unflinching ridiculosity that is Kampuki? Everyone else gets transported to the alternate world because they're a close genetic match to Pet Force, but Pookie is literally a stuffed bear who, even in the reality where Garfield comes from, doesn't talk. He gets isekai'd alongside everyone else and suddenly he's talking science and shit and everyone just kind of accepts it. Meanwhile, Odie still doesn't talk, even as Odious. It's pretty fucked. Anyways, Vetvix's titular caniner creature is a badass with the one flaw being that he speaks like a British fancy man. Bringing it back to my adaptation tangent, this whole setup feels like something an Illumination movie sequel would do, where they have a new villain but they have them specifically voiced by insert big name comedian here because, hey, isn't that funny but also highly profitable from a box office standpoint? So in addition to Big Dog Man, Vetvix makes what's essentially a smart ray that increases the intellect of animals, having Caniner use it on a planet of dog lovers to have the dogs of that planet enslave the humans. With this whole setup of dogs and intellect, I really thought they were going to use this to finally have Odie talk and express his feelings, as being essentially the dumb one of the group and his personal opinions on that matter. It takes a lot more generic route with its plot, but honestly, considering how thoughtfully introspective they got with Garfield/Garzuka in the last book, I stand by 8-year-old me's critique, if only based on that one comic strip where you find out Odie is secretly smart behind everyone's backs. Also, in the B-plot of this entry, Vetvix takes her time off to hunt down Pie-Rat and magic him to the inside of an asteroid light years away from anyone, which is such an unnecessary but appreciated side story. It's so separated from the rest of the plot, with his ice planet and wizard in a cave named Barfo, and Vetvix disguising herself as a gremlin to further entrap Pie-Rat. Title bomb really popping off here, we didn't deserve this. Menace of the Mutinator brings it back to Vetvix's fixation on taking animals and splicing them into hybrid creatures, a la Sid from Toy Story, down to their comically mismatched body parts that magically fit since Vetvix is a sorceress in addition to being a scientist and vet. You go, Queen. Early volumes make mention of her pet being her first animal splicing experiment, where she takes the head of a gorilla and places it on the body of a pit bull, naming it Gorbull. And Book 4 more or less takes that character detail and rolls with it. Menace of the Mutinator is a direct sequel to Canine or Dog of Doom, picking up after the last book's cliffhanger ending where Garfield and the lads are stuck in the isekai world due to some kind of magical interference. Sorcerer Binky is called to see what's going on when his cauldron gets whatever the magic version of hacked is, and sucks in Pet Force directly into Vetvix's lair where they're actually factually hacked to pieces, and brought back together into this chimera of all their superpowers. Garzuka, being the one Pet Forcer that didn't get sucked into the cauldron, remains with Emperor John, Sorcerer Binky, and the added wrinkle of John Arbuckle, who was freshly isekai'd as a result of Vetvix's magical interference. Everything about this volume feels like the final release in the series, from John finding out the gang's superhero identities to Vetvix in turn realizing the Pet Force's civilian identities and exploiting those weaknesses. There's a lot of finality sprinkled throughout the plot. I just wish the Mutinator itself was a more interesting villain. Even as a kid, the whole trope of the Chimera enemy made out of parts from only the bestest characters felt like a limited concept, and the Mutinator is no exception. Its backstory more interesting than its own character. Made with the help of Vetvix's combination machine, Mutinator was made from removing select body parts and components from each Pet Forcer's body, remaining pieces being left in a cell for later use, like the leftover chili flakes after pizza night. We even see Garzuka storm Vetvix's fortress to see his teammates imprisoned and missing the parts of their body used to form the Mutinator. Understandably, there are no illustrations for that particular scene, but Titlebaum's writing does more than enough to get the point across. Garzuka was horrified to see Odious' head floating in midair, drooling. He saw Starlina's arms reaching up and touching her headless shoulders over and over. Kompuki floated lifelessly within his force field. Little more than a stuffed teddy bear now that his computer brain had been given to the Mutinator. The scene does try to bring some levity with Abnormal's constant puns relating to her no longer having any hands, but the reality for these characters is just so much more horrifying than anyone in-universe gives it credit for, which somehow makes things that much worse. Seeing the Pet Force so thoroughly incapacitated just made me wish they did more with this plot point, taking what remained of their bodies and trying to function as a team regardless. Even the back of the book has a re-scrambled team with the tagline, "The New Pet Force?" Unfortunately, seeing a Frankenstein team fight never makes its way into the story itself, the re-scrambled team being used more as a moment of humor near the end of the story than anything consequential. What we instead get is John's accidental success as he falls into Sorcerer Binky's warp cauldron, knocking out Vetvix and reversing the effects of the combination machine in this moment of extreme buffoonery. We do get a more satisfying conclusion as Garzuka has to repeatedly work the combination machine while fending off Vetvix, but I remember being a bit let down that the other Pet Forcers had no real agency to saving themselves, more or less being four separate maidens for Garfield and John to save in the end. Nonetheless, it does work as a solid conclusion to the series. Oh wait, there's one more. For the longest time, I thought Attack of the Lethal Lizards was a cancelled project, existing only as concept art on the more obscure parts of the internet. Or maybe I talked myself into believing that since I didn't want to waste the $7 to buy it used online. But hey, it's been 22 years, it's about time I finally finished this series. Oh. So one Amazon refund and additional purchase later, Attack of the Lethal Lizards has been successfully bought, and it was... I'm sure it has to do with being a grown man-child reading a chapter book meant for 8-year-olds, but a lot of Pet Force 5 feels more like a soft reboot than an actual continuation of the series. Focus shifts away from the now-defeated Vetvix to a group of lizards that gain human intelligence, thanks to their planet being directly under Vetvix's fortress, or swamp home collecting traces of Vetvix's magic over time. A fine enough setup, but when it's revealed that the lizards started off as regular textbook, non-talking quadrupedal lizards with little to no motivation for wanting to use their powers, things start to fall apart. And it's not like past villains were the epitome of character writing either, but they had a personality, or at least a shtick to keep readers entertained. Here the lizards occasionally bicker with each other, but even then it's used more as a running joke rather than a setup for anything meaningful that would come back by the climax. Also, this happens. Not exactly the best way to cap off the series, but maybe that's because there were things coming down the pipeline. No! This Pet Force movie shouldn't exist and you can't make me watch it. Holy shit, that was upsetting! The internet already has enough man-children hatefully nitpicking media meant for tiny children, so I'll save you the tantrum and just say you're a bigger person by avoiding this entirely, fan or not. What's actually worth the time to discuss is Pet Force's return through Kaboom's release of Garfield comics. Not being tied to a newspaper comic format, the Kaboom comics serve as a solid spiritual successor to the Garfield and Friends cartoon more than anything else in recent memory. Sorry, modern Garfield comics. The 25-page issues are just the right length to allow for longer-running stories while still keeping the episodic nature of a Garfield story. I'd say it's because Mark Evanier, who worked on the Garfield and Friends series, is credited in a good number of issues, but he was also involved in that awful Garfield show, which eventually spawned that awful Pet Force movie, so it's definitely not just him alone. Like a lot of American comic productions, Garfield's Pet Force comics have a long alternating cast of creatives behind it. Even focusing on the Pet Force-centric stories alone, the team is still pretty sizable, full of industry vets and newer creatives alike. Of note, however, is the inclusion of Gary Barker as artist, the same Gary Barker that pitched that Pet Force shirt design to Jim Davis all those years ago. Barker has been part of the Paws team for 30 plus years at this point, and his contributions to Garfield cannot be overstated. He's been a major factor not only to Pet Force, but the newspaper comics proper, and nearly every other Garfield work you've probably been in contact with. Checking his website and social media, you can tell he has a soft spot for Pet Force in particular, his open attitude toward crossovers suggested by his art students only further reflecting this creative spirit. It's not the most ideal, but to have at least one of the founding Pet Force creatives on these new comics does bring a smile to my face. Released in May 2012, these Garfield comics really spent no time resurrecting Pet Force, with issue 5 reintroducing them to audiences in September 2012, and being sprinkled occasionally through the comics run from that point forward. On a technical level, these Pet Force comics serve the same function as the US Acres segments of the Garfield and Friends show. They may not have featured the core cast, but its writing style and sensibilities still worked within a vastly different world. Running gags like the Klopman Diamond worked their way in, as well as a very Garfield and Friends sense of contempt towards certain lines of work. The Contractor of Doom story in particular reminding me of the Garfield and Friends episode where John becomes a radio DJ.
Hey, John, you're beautiful.
No, you're beautiful.
No, you're beautiful.
No, you're beautiful.
But I think what makes this current iteration of Pet Force especially interesting is how it handles its lore. While stories are more or less contained within its own issue, Pet Force actually takes the time to work the original Scholastic books into the lore with the Garfield Pet Force 2014 special. Working both as a tribute to those original books, as well as a parody of American superhero comics, the 2014 special creates a Crisis on Infinite Earth style scenario, where the Scholastic and current Kaboom Pet Force teams have their realities integrated. Alongside some nods to the original books, the current team also picks up some details that were originally exclusive to the Scholastic books. Specifically, Abnormal finally gets his freezing powers, and Kampuki gets added back to the team. Finally. Like, I get that he's more on the tech side than the fighting side of things, but Kampuki being left out of the comics and the god-awful special was just rude. It's rude! He's a cuddly teddy bear with a mini CRT helmet. I don't care that your franchise has too many mascot characters. Give me Kampuki! To get any kind of Pet Force media after the chapter books ended in '99 was like this bizarro monkey's paw. Having that CG movie felt like feigned care for an obscure spin-off series, simple lip service for the handful of people that grew up with this specific iteration of Garfield. So to have that followed up a few years later with Kaboom's comics was honestly more than I could have asked for. Seeing Vevix gather all the other villains back together on top of adding in a few more to fight Garzuka and the gang, it was like the series never left. Kaboom conveniently collected all their Pet Force-related Garfield comics into 2 releases, the 2013 and 2014 Garfield's Pet Force specials. Reading that second volume and seeing a postscript describing the original Scholastic series with the original tagline of "Let the Fur Fly," it really made the release feel like a labor of love. Taking a property that's been buried in years of obscurity and treating it with the same amount of reverence and childlike excitement that I had when reading the original books more than 20 years ago. They didn't have to do that, but they did. And I'm genuinely happier because of it. Garfield is an easy target for criticism. Between its formulaic simplicity and overwhelming glut of merchandising, it's easy to frame the franchise as a soulless, unfunny cash grab that's a shell of its former self. And maybe that's true to some degree. But to use his argument as a means to dismiss literal years of creative merit seems disingenuous, and means to have a harsh opinion for the sake of having a harsh opinion. Like, Walt Disney's head is definitely frozen and buried beneath Disneyland, so it can be unthawed to gaze upon the monolithic landscape of pop culture it's formed. But I'm still gonna enjoy the occasional Pixar movie because when a thing's good, I'm not gonna deny myself it for the sake of internet hot take brownie points. Their creative process has peaks and valleys, and Garfield is no exception. Its long history only making those peaks and valleys easier to spot and criticize in the most shallow way possible. And it's among these shallow takes and incessant poking at modern Garfield that we forget that the series and overall franchise used to be innovative. Specifically, it found innovation through what has become one of the least innovative genres in anime and literature. But with a spotty set of releases over the course of 2 decades, Pet Force remains a cultural oddity. Less because it failed miserably, and more because it existed for a spell before fading into the background. It was a superhero series that came into existence at a time when superhero comics were dangerously close to falling off the face of the earth. It found refuge in the world of chapter books, carving out its own niche alongside series twice as long and popular, proving that Garfield as a franchise can shape itself to any medium and fanbase it fully commits itself to. Cynics will say this is yet another brand artificially extending its shelf life to extend its reach and push more products on the ignorant masses. But this argument underestimates the intelligence of targeted demographics, especially the brutally honest demographic that is children. Say what you will about what still gets passed for children's entertainment, but kids know when a series is bullshitting them. And at the very least, if they aren't entertained, or if they know there's a better alternative, then they're not going to show up to support it. When I revisited the Pet Force books for this video essay, I was lucky enough to still have my original 4 books on me, in pretty good condition. As I started each one, I would immediately be greeted by my 8-year-old self's signature, neatly written in pencil on the bottom left corner of the cover page. Some volumes have receipts from bookstores that don't even exist anymore, at prices that inflation has made impossible by today's standards. I even found a Pet Force drawing I made on construction paper. And it's these little details left within these pages that made me want to talk about the series in the first place, like tidbits of memories transporting me to a new world. Garfield exists more as a concept than a strict lore to be obeyed, and that's how Pet Force came into existence in the first place. It's why the internet has clung so closely to the Garfield character, reworking him and the cast to whatever whims it deems worthy. The malleability of the character can lead to an innumerable amount of iterations until we reach the point that your vision of Garfield can be different than mine or anyone else's. And while its venture into chapter books was short-lived, its new venture into children's comics gives me hope that Garfield can get younger audiences into graphic novels in the same way the likes of Dr. Seuss or Roald Dahl got them into novels. Garfield has served as this sense of familiarity for many, and thus creates an accessibility point for people otherwise new to media like comics or even chapter books if they're younger readers. And I think that alone is accomplishment enough, and telling of the legacy and impression even an obscure title like Pet Force is able to leave.